And now we turn to our interview with Rick Cole.
Rick, so I understand that you've mostly pivoted out of the public sector into the private sector and specifically working on the problems of homelessness and houselessness. Um, what made you decide to focus your energies there?
No, it's not really the private sector in the sense that
Right.
I'm not working for a company that earns a profit. Um, I'm working directly with the San Gabriel Valley Council of Governments. We talk a little bit about who they are and what they do as we go on. But mostly, I'm putting my energy into working with advocacy groups in the nonprofit world, the public advocates, a faith-based group here in Pasadena, making housing and community happen. POP, which is a multi-issue progressive group working on housing justice as one of the prongs of making Pasadena model progressive city, as you heard from Hannah at the outset. And I'm also working with a countywide group that's got presence here in Pasadena called Abundant Housing LA. Um, and all three of those groups align around um, trying to do everything we can to ensure that everyone has access to safe and affordable housing. That's not the case now. And that's really at the root of the homelessness crisis that's engulfed our entire region. And so my focus is on changing the policies, changing the programs, and frankly, changing the political will in cities like Pasadena to do what can be done, what should be done, what must be done to make housing a human right.
And how do you do that? What is your capacity with working with the groups that you work with? You make
Sure.
sure people aren't doubling up on I mean, what do you do?
Well, part of what I'm doing is trying to be an advisor because having been an elected official for 12 years, mayor here in Pasadena, having been a city manager in 3 cities, having been a deputy mayor for the city of Los Angeles, and having responsibility, for a $5 billion budget. I have insight not just into what ought to be done, but more importantly, I think into how it can actually get done. There are a lot of well-intentioned activists who are fighting for the right cause, but then how do we translate what ought to be done into actual programs and policies and funding mechanisms to get them done? And that's where I think I can play a key role. Plus, just I'm putting my passion into this because I think that um, it is. Look, there are a lot of issues, and they're all interrelated. Institutional racism, criminal justice reform, economic justice. Um, Ultimately, though, housing is really central here in Southern California and here in Pasadena. Because if people can't afford to live here, then they've got to commute from far away or live out on the streets. And that's just environmentally, politically, socially, and morally unsustainable. And there's another dimension that goes beyond the injustice to individuals and the disruption to communities. And that is the fifth largest, California is the fifth largest economy in the world. And we can't continue to be prosperous and successful unless A, that prosperity is more widely shared, and B, concomitant to that is people have to be securely housed. And people are not securely housed. Even people who have a roof over their head are often one paycheck away from losing that roof over their head. And that kind of insecurity, I think, casts a shadow over Southern California. I've grew up here in Southern California. Um, I spent my life here. I hope my kids will have an opportunity if they choose to live here. But look, Southern California's got a lot going for it. It's one of the most diverse and dynamic places on the planet. But unless we can get our arms around this increasingly vicious housing challenge, We're going to lose a lot of our quality of life. We're going to continue to degrade the environment, and individual people and families and communities are going to suffer.
Well, speaking of progressive politics in Pasadena, my understanding is the city council did pretty well by the renters at the beginning of the pandemic and provided some kind of safety net for them or protecting them from getting evicted. Um, do you know how that worked exactly, and is that being sustained?
Sure, that happened both at the state level and in a
Okay.
number of communities, Los Angeles, Pasadena, Long Beach, Santa Monica, where as part of the health emergency, recognizing the economic disruption and people potentially losing their homes, a rent freeze was put in place. And ultimately, the federal rent freeze was put in place as well. The I'm sorry, it's an eviction freeze. I misspoke. So if there are various rules about what you need to do, but basically, if you can demonstrate that you have been economically significantly impacted by the impacts of COVID, then you can't be evicted just for not paying your rent.
Hmm.
Um, for the duration of the emergency. The federal level, that is about to run out. It runs out February 15th, and there's a scramble to try to extend that. Um, at the local level, I think everyone recognizes that the cities in Southern California are going to see it through to the end of the health emergency. Then what happens is the question, right? And Pasadena and other communities haven't figured out what happens then.
Hmm.
Um, the the cumulative impact of these unpaid rent bills are going to be staggering for some individuals and some families. And no one is saying you don't have to pay that, right? So all the cities are saying you got to pay it. You just don't have to pay it now. And if you don't pay it now, you won't be evicted. Well, when that goes away, then what happens? And the answer is we could have tens of thousands of people losing their apartments and homes. A recent study by UCLA suggested that just here in LA County, by the end of 2023, their best estimate is we would have 52,000 working age adults who would have lost their housing.
Oh.
So that's very much a key issue that Pasadena and other communities are going to have to face. And there's no easy answer. Um, Short of federal help, the many of the people who rent from what are today still individual property owners who have to pay their mortgage and have to pay their utility bills and have to pay their maintenance and all of that. Increasingly, unfortunately, they, given this economic squeeze, are selling out to giant Wall Street-backed equity firms that are vacuuming up um, multifamily housing all over the country. And so that's another part of this crisis. They see an opportunity. The tenants are stressed. The apartment owners, in many cases, the so-called mom and pop apartment owners who are counting on that for their retirement, they are stressed. And so who is coming to rescue not of the renters, not of the mom and pop, but to the rescue of their shareholders are these equity firms who think that they can come in, scoop up these apartments for distressed prices and own valuable Southern California real estate for a song. That's part of the challenge that we're going to be having to face.
Well, it doesn't sound like that would help us in the long run. It's more of a short-term solution.
So exactly, and so one of the things that more and more people are talking about is removing some of this housing from the private market, because if it's going to end up on Wall Street, um, uh, we're going to be at the mercy of people trying to squeeze out the maximum possible rent with the least possible investment. Um, so there's another alternative to Wall Street buying properties. homes, and that is nonprofits buying them, churches buying them, turning them into co-ops so that the people who live there can buy them over the long term.
Mhm.
Remember that the great prosperity of the United States after World War II was basically founded on two foundations,
Mhm.
uh, arguably three. First of all, obviously, unions coming out of the Depression and World War II were much stronger than they are today. But the two I was thinking about that directly apply to housing. Number one is the GI Bill, where um, tens of millions of families got the opportunity to buy a home. And with FHA financing and all these other federal interventions, we created a giant home building industry that put wealth uh, into the hands of primarily white people at the
Yes.
time, because
Yeah.
there were
It
real
should be noted. Yes.
restrictions. There were real restrictions on Mexican American and Negroes, as they would have been called in the 40s and 50s, being able to buy or to get loans under those. But the tens of millions of Americans got the opportunity to buy a home with federal help. And the other piece of that was, of course, the education, the GI Bill to give people collegiate education. So they got educations and they got opportunity to buy their own homes. There's an opportunity today. It's hard for us to imagine because we weren't alive or we weren't paying attention, in the 40s when these bills were passed. But that was revolution with a small r, of a revolution of putting education and ownership into the hands of ordinary people. Well, in this crisis, the government could step in and it could support taking housing out of the hands of private equity firms and making it a public good, just as the public universities, right,
Mhm.
or public housing.
Well,
So
and I wonder if there'd be any argument for giving preference to people of color since they really didn't get to take advantage of it in the 50s. Perhaps it could be kind of an equalizing measure of sorts because of the GI Bill, it's white people who have this generational wealth because they got a leg up on owning property. So I wonder if
yeah,
there's
I think
a
in
preferential
fairness,
treatment.
income is a pretty good substitute for trying
Mhm.
to puzzle things out by ethnicity, because
Mhm.
the poor people who are left behind who are white are not beneficiaries of that, so they really shouldn't be penalized for that. And
Sure.
then, unfortunately, disproportionately, because of these past policies, there's a greater number of low-income people who are people of color. So if you focus it in on folks who are low income, I
Mhm.
think it disproportionately benefits people of color, but and helps correct that long-term imbalance. But it doesn't say, if you're a poor white person, you are disenfranchised. I think
Sure.
we ought to be focusing this on folks who've been left out
Mhm.
of the security that most of us take for granted. Most of us take for granted that we're going to have a roof over our head. In times of economic stress, that becomes much more problematic, right? Even well-off people who lose their jobs or who lose their businesses, have to deal with the insecurity of perhaps losing their home. But this is a chronic condition for low-income people. 58% of Pasadena's are renters. That's increased significantly. When I was on the city council, a majority of Pasadena residents were home owners. That's not true today. 58% of the folks rent. Um, the median rent in Pasadena is like $2,800. 97% of the apartments in Pasadena for rent for more than $1,500, and 76% rent for more than 2,000. So that means you've got $24,000 right off the bat, before you paid your taxes, before you fed your kids. $24,000 just to keep a roof over your head for you and your family, and that's just unsustainable for most working families. So the reality is they are constantly under threat of how we're going to pay this month's rent, even before COVID. And now with COVID, people work in restaurants, people work in hotels, people who get sick. All of these folks now are dogged by this everyday stress of worrying about whether they're going to be living out of their car next month. And so this is a real crisis, and we have to treat it like a crisis. But we also, as you suggested a moment before, we have to be thinking about long-term solutions. There's things we have to do right now to keep people from losing their homes. But in the long run, we need structural change. And again, as I suggested, back in the 40s, they made structural changes. Millions of people came back from the factories and the war, and they wanted a new home. And America, with massive federal intervention, met that challenge by and large. And this is a time for us to again rise to that challenge. Millions of people are under stress of losing their homes or not being able really to afford, if they pay their rent, what else they won't be able to pay for.
Right.
And that's a crisis that the government has a key role in.
Well,
And,
certainly the
and we
house.
have to press. That's where the political will comes in. We have to press to make sure that our governments respond.
Well, and we didn't have the political will before the pandemic. This was already a crisis, the housing crisis, before we're dealing with the pandemic. And at $2,000 a month for rent, that is comparable to a mortgage payment. So if there was structural change that could change that to home ownership at, comparable spending, then yeah, maybe there would be hope. But it is time for our halftime musical break. More Red Hot Chili Peppers. This is Can't Stop from the album By the Way. All right, and welcome back to Pop Talk.
Rick, I'm proud to be a Norwegian American, and this will make sense in a little bit of a preface. And Norwegians are pretty much aligned with it being a human right to have shelter.
Mhm.
And meanwhile, Americans are so afraid of socialism. What do you do about people who, first of all, aren't educated about what it is or isn't? And, people like Trump going, Norway, that's a great place, but they don't remember that it's in many ways a socialist um, country with a big dose of capitalism. But what do you say to people?
Yeah, I think that's a bigger question. The more relevant question, or the more direct issue with housing is people remember Pruitt-Igoe. They may not know that name, but they remember the big, tall public housing projects that were such colossal failures that they ended up blowing them up. And I think that our first challenge, is not Americans' uh, skepticism about the word socialism. Our biggest challenge in housing is that the public sector made some ham-handed interventions in the 40s, and there are some reasons why that was subverted from the beginning. Some ways in which had we been not so afraid of public housing, it could have worked, because it does work in other mixed economies in the world that are not socialist. So uh, I think that, in particular at the local level, I think that when you get into what calling it Democrat, Republican, Socialist, Capitalist, sometimes that gets people's blood running, but not necessarily their brains function. And I think if we ought to be appealing to people's pragmatic sense of, are you unhappy about homelessness? Because people all across the political spectrum are heartsick about that. Um, on social media, you'll read some really vile stuff, but I don't think that represents the average person. I think the average person thinks, well, that's too bad. They may not they certainly are angry about someone, dealing drugs in the park, but I think they recognize, the vast majority of people recognize that the vast majority of people who are homeless um, have had some trauma that's put them out on the street. So I think pragmatically, we need to appeal to folks that we've got some significant, serious, expensive problems. Malcolm Gladwell, who's well known for his books, he wrote an interesting article 20 years ago now called $1 Million Murder, where he actually tracked one homeless person in his 50s who was an alcoholic. And he cost the city of Philadelphia and the county, whatever the structure is back east, over the course of about 5 years, $1 million of arrests for public inebriation or for urinating in public or what have you, emergency room visits, um, and and I think that's just flagrant waste of human potential, waste of taxpayer dollars. So, to your point about Norway and the United States and socialism and capitalism, those are important questions. I don't mean to dismiss them, but I think there's an even more direct route to change, and that is saying what's going on now is not working well. We have too many people who can't afford a home at all. Too many people who are worried about losing their homes. Too many people who are paying too much out of their income to keep their homes. What can we do to help fix that? That makes sense. And part of it is building more homes, the right kind of homes in the right places. Part of that is figuring out how to take the resources we're wasting on things like policing and emergency room response. So we move into crime prevention and we move into health care instead of waiting for people to be in crisis and then sending the cops or taking them to the emergency room. And those are just pragmatic, sensible, common sense things that I think people, regardless of their sort of political ideologies or assumptions, can find common ground. I don't think that's naive. I think that's in fact realistic, given the deep political divides in our society. I think we have to build coalitions across some of these sharp divides, coalitions of both self-interest, right? This makes sense for everybody to have fewer homeless people, to pay less in taxes for emergency response that could be prevented, but also not just self-interest, but community interest. Right? Pasadena is a community, and we ought to take care of people in our community. That doesn't, that sometimes when people on the left talk about taking care, people on the right think, oh, you're just making everybody dependent on the welfare and government, so they'll vote for you. That's not how they feel if they go to church on Sunday. That's not necessarily how they feel about their neighbor or a mentally ill member of their family. So it doesn't always have to be government, right? It can be the nonprofit sector, it can be the faith sector. They need to be key partners in this, but we need to help people help themselves. I think that's very much the American way.
Well, preemptively helping people avoid homelessness, what is the most effective way to do that?
Well, there are two things. One is we need housing that people can afford, and we need a better system for helping keep people in that housing. So systematically over the last 30 years in California, particularly here in Southern California, particularly closer to the coast, we've made it really, really, really difficult to build new housing of any type. Affordable housing, market rate housing, luxury housing. It's very difficult to build housing. It was easy at one time to build housing out there somewhere, right? Vast tracts in Rancho Cucamonga. We began to realize, A, that's environmentally catastrophic, and B, it means people are having to do these 2, 3, 4 hour commutes to jobs. So people don't want to live way out there and have to commute, and it's environmentally degrading to do that. But building housing in existing communities has been very difficult. Pasadena's actually done a pretty good job of that, but we're 140,000 out of a county of 10 million, and a lot of our surrounding cities have not done that. So one of the key things is we need to actually build more housing. I'm not a big fan of Texas. Um, they have their problems as a red state. Their prison system, has problems. Their education system, their social welfare system, but they don't have the homeless and housing affordability crises we have because it's not so bloody difficult to build housing. So that's one thing is we just need to stop making it really, really, really hard. And that's also for affordable housing. You know, the typical affordable housing project, that is a project designed for people of low income that they can have a safe community to live in for as long as they need that. Um, that that kind of a project typically has to go to at least five different funding sources. And each one of those five funding sources has different rules, different timelines, different schedules. And so you got to apply here, and then you apply there, and then you haven't heard from this one, but you're hoping to get that one. And so projects stretch out 4 or 5 years. That's crazy, right? We should have, when the state gives out a grant, we shouldn't have a grant. Well, if it's veterans housing, you go here. If it's senior housing, you go here. If it's near transit, you go there. There should be a pool of funding for affordable projects. We could ask more private developers if we didn't run them through such ridiculous hoops. We could ask more of them. We could set the rules higher. We can get more, but just simply say, if you meet the rules, then you get a permit, rather than, well, we'll do an environmental impact report, and then we'll have long negotiations, and we'll have public hearings, and we'll send you bing back forth, make you redesign the project 16 times, and you don't even know at the end of the day when you get a project. It's no wonder they say, no, we can't do any affordable housing. Oh, no, we can't do anything for the community. We can't afford it. Well, part of the reason is a lot of money is wasted through these long, complicated processes.
So we,
So
we need to
um,
change the laws for that, right? The
we,
policies, for
we
all that
do
hoop jumping.
we do, but Pasadena is a place where we could do that, right? I mean, it's you don't have to wait for Sacramento or Washington D.C. The other thing, though, that I think is key is keeping people in their homes, right? And that doesn't just mean free legal help to when they get an eviction notice. Um, there are lots of things that could be done to make the rental relationship more secure. Um, and there are policies that I don't think it makes sense to go into in detail on this program, but there are things that should make it, and that in the long run will be good for landlords as well, because they'll have a more secure and stable base of tenants. The classic disappearing mom and pop landlord, um, it wasn't completely a figment of the imagination of the propagandists, that there were people who bought apartment buildings and liked keeping tenants and would even moderate the rent increases to keep people in their homes. That's a model that Wall Street doesn't believe in, but actually could work in the private market. But given that those mom and pop landlords are being driven out of the business, there's no reason why we can't substitute co-op ownership. There's no reason why we can't substitute faith-based ownership. There's no reason why we can't substitute nonprofits owning those things. And we can keep people in stable environments. That's good for their kids. That's good for them hanging on to their jobs. It's good for the community, right? Because they put down roots, they vote, they get active. They're safer because they know their neighbors. There's all kinds of good reasons for us to do this, besides just that we care about the people that are insecure in their housing. It's good for the community, and I think we need to make that case across the board in the community. right now we have such polarized environments. I think we have to overcome that.
I have, going back to your observation that Pasadena has increased its renters percentage. What do you attribute that to? Is it just simply cost of housing, or not being able to get a down payment for a house, or any number of factors? What are those factors?
Sure. Well, again, one of the factors is the median housing price in Pasadena is now north of $1 million, right? So that's, a mortgage of $1 million is past the reach of the vast majority of working families. Um, Second, the new multifamily have been predominantly rental properties for reasons that have to do with Wall Street finance. Um, and again, the ability of people to be able to support those mortgages. And finally, the federal government, um, needs to be thinking about not what worked in 1947, which is the mortgage interest deduction, but what will work in 2021. The millennials and Generation Z, they're coming out of college. Great, they've got a degree, but they've also got 20, 50, $100,000 worth of student loan debt, um, and they're living. The jobs are in these high cost cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Seattle, um, and nobody's paying attention to them. No one's saying, okay, well, how do we help you get a solid footing um, as an American? It's like you're on your own. We, the baby boomers, who had the benefit of fantastic investment by our parents in public education, we who were the children of the people who benefited from the GI Bill and FHA and mortgage interest, we have a good, and then we got Prop 13 to keep our property taxes low, and it's predominantly an older, white voting base, and the younger people, the people under 40, people of color, people low income folks, folks just coming out of college, the children of those baby boomers. Um, the policies are not being made to take into account the realities and their needs, and that has to change. That has to change. And it will start in Pasadena because it's something no one's paid much attention to, and that is the change of elections from March to November. Right, the March elections. When I was elected to the city council, in 1/7 of the city, I won with 58% of the vote, a landslide. I won every precinct. You know how many votes I got? I got 1,000 votes. Right,
Ugh.
I got 1,000 votes to be one of the 7 city council members for the city. Um, that was because few people vote in March elections, and it's significantly skewed toward homeowners, toward older people, toward long-term Pasadena. Now in November, in the last election, practically everyone voted. We had something like an 80% turnout. And that includes, again, lower income people, younger people, renters, people of color, vulnerable seniors. They're now voting in local elections. Now, they don't pay much attention yet to those local elections because they don't understand the significance of how it affects their daily lives. And by the way, neither does City Hall. City Hall's not paying attention to them because they don't pay attention to City Hall. That has to change. And one of the ways in which that could change, as well as the changing of elections, which is already taking place, is redrawing the lines. So every 10 years, the lines have to be redrawn for Congress and for the state assembly and the state senate. The same is also true of redrawing the lines for the city council. For years, for decades, the districts in Pasadena have been laid out around Colorado Boulevard. Half the districts are north of Colorado Boulevard, half the districts are south of Colorado Boulevard. The most renters in town live just on either side of Colorado Boulevard. So they're a classic dispersion of their votes. There are few people in this district, few people in this district. If they had a district of their own, renters in the city would have a voice on the council. There are no renters 58% of the people don't have a voice on the city council. That has to change. And if I could say one thing that will get me in trouble, but I think it's good trouble. I think it's necessary trouble, as John Lewis would say. I've been gone from Pasadena for 21 years. It's the town I grew up in. I came back because it's my hometown. I love this city. It hasn't changed enough. In the 21 years I've been gone, it's largely stood still. We used to be an environmental leader. We used to be a social justice leader. We used to make policies that other cities emulated. And largely that has stopped. Largely, we do not innovate. We do not do groundbreaking, pioneer things. And the reason is there isn't a movement pushing for it. This, change doesn't come from above. Change comes, as we all know, when people say we have needs and we're going to organize with like-minded people, and we're going to build coalitions with people who have similar goals, and we're going to fight for change. And so one of the things that has to change is representation on the city council. We fought when I was on the council for representation for people of color. And we've made huge progress, right? You look at the 8 members of the city council, there are 3 African Americans and a Latino on the city council in Pasadena. That's progress. 0 renters. That's not progress, and we have to make progress in that arena.
Well, indeed, power concedes nothing, and there's an opportunity coming up for the coalition to start flexing its muscles, and that is in the housing element. Pop has talked about taking on affordable housing issues more from the front end rather than reacting to the crises on the back end. So could you tell us, for our listeners and viewers who have no idea what a housing element is, what is that, and what's the event coming up?
Sure. So this coming Saturday, January 23rd at 3 p.m., we're having a community forum to explain to people what's a housing element. We have a housing element. No one knows about it. No one's read it. No one cares about it. And it has very little impact. This one will count, and here's why. The state requires every city, there are 482 in California, to have a housing element. And by the way, the state has to approve your housing element for it to go into effect. And it's supposed to be a document that demonstrates that you have analyzed your housing challenges in your community, and you figured out how to meet your share of building housing for the region inside your borders. And every 8 years you have to do that. And every 8 years, Pasadena's been doing that, and they've been getting state approval. And they build a lot of housing, but not as much as they should have, particularly in affordable housing, for a variety of reasons. This time, the state is very serious and will not approve housing elements that don't realistically show that you can meet your allocations. And the allocations are very ambitious for cities like Pasadena now. They're 3 times what they were 8 years ago. So it's a huge challenge for Pasadena to both write a housing element that will produce these results, and then to implement that housing element and to go forward and produce it. So this is an opportunity for the community through workshops and organizing, through the Planning Commission and ultimately the City Council, to hammer out a comprehensive strategy for how our city is going to tackle affordability, how we're going to build new housing, how we're going to make sure that a significant portion of that is affordable to people, how we're going to reduce homelessness, and how we're going to open up new paths for home ownership for people. That's the challenge, and that's what we're going to talk about at our community forum. And we've already begun to build a coalition of the 3 founding members of the groups that I've been working with. Abundant Housing LA, Making Housing Community Happen, and Pasadena's Organizing for Progress. We've also gotten support from the NAACP, from groups that advocate for transportation, League of Young Voters, groups that see the connection to the things they care deeply about, whether it's racial equity or government transparency or access to mobility, they see the relationship that housing plays to all of those goals. So we're going to build a broad coalition to work on this housing element. It has a deadline. It has to go to the state in October. That's 9 months from now. And so in the next 9 months, we have to do everything we can to influence the public dialogue, to take this challenge seriously and to come up with a sensible plan that has the policies, the programs, and the funding and the will to make it happen. And that's a huge challenge, but it's a great challenge. And it could put, again, Pasadena in the driver's seat for us to begin again to be a pioneering, innovative model for other communities of doing the right thing.
Before we wrap up, Rick, what do you think of the new city council and their relationship to housing and responding to our situation in Pasadena?
Well, I'm hopeful, but not optimistic.
Mhm.
And I'm not optimistic because we haven't heard much yet from the council on this, as it's reconstituted. Um, but I'm hopeful because one of the first things that Mayor Gordo talked about since his election was creating a housing commission to tackle the affordability challenge. And I'm hopeful that he will follow through on that, that he'll appoint some people who will do a good job on that, that there'll be broad outreach for the housing element, and that as a result of all of those efforts, that what comes before the city council will be taken and approved is an ambitious, realistic, um, and, and comprehensive approach to the affordable housing crisis. Anything less than that, I think, is a problem. But I'm hopeful, but we'll see. They haven't, and give them some slack, right? They've got COVID. They're brand new. They just, Mayor Gordo is in the mayor's chair for the first time. Felicia Williams is brand new on the council. So we need to give them some space, but we also, because we have to have a housing element by October, we need to get working on this challenge sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I really want to encourage our Pasadena listeners to attend this forum. It's a week from tomorrow, correct? January 26th. We'll
26th.
certainly have a link to it on our pop Facebook page, and I'm sure Making Housing and Community Happen will have access listed somewhere through their website or social media. So Rick, thank you so much. This has been really inspiring and informative, and just wonder if you had any last thoughts to share.
Well, you quoted Frederick Douglass. Power concedes nothing without a
Yeah.
struggle. Um, I think that we need to take this on with the attitude of being happy warriors, right? If we're successful, and we there's really no alternative. Failure is not an option. Um, we're going to get people off the streets who are living, in tents and under tarps. If we're successful, we're going to get hardworking people who are essential workers. That the quality of housing for them and their kids they deserve. If we're successful, we won't have 700 students in our public schools living in cars or couch surfing with their families. If we're successful, Pasadena will be a model. So I think that's a joyous challenge and opportunity, and I think we should relish that we live in this time, and that we can come together to make a difference in the lives of people who are part of our community and who deserve our help. And it's also an opportunity to address some of the long-standing racial scars in the city. I've just written an article that it's going to come out in Pasadena now about the history of racial covenants in Pasadena. It's a dark and grim history. In 1940, 60% of the homes in Pasadena had a covenant that said they could not be sold to someone who is not, quote, entirely of the white or Caucasian race, and that no one could live in those homes who was not entirely of the white or Caucasian race except servants. That's 1940.
Mhm.
That's 80 years ago. There are people alive today who were alive in those days. In 1942, a couple, the Raines family, moved into 743 Palisade Street, just off the Arroyo. And because the home they bought was covered by one of these covenants, they were sued by their neighbors. And in those days, the courts said it's a slam dunk. There's no question. And they issued an injunction for them to leave their home. They could not live in their home. They were violating the law because they were black. And and it went to the California Appeals Court. And the appeals court said, well, this is simple. They're black. They're not supposed to be there. The injunction stands. And a civil rights attorney from Los Angeles took their case to the Supreme Court of California. And he knew that the law was not on his side. So he didn't challenge the constitutionality of it, but he said, there are black people living nearby. So really, does it make any difference whether black people live on this side of the street or that side of the street? And amazingly, the California Supreme Court reversed the trial court, reversed the appeals court, and allowed the Raines family to live in the home they had bought.
Wow.
That attorney went on, along with Thurgood Marshall, to argue 4 years later in front of the United States Supreme Court the landmark decision Shelley versus Kramer, which struck down racial covenants in America in 1947 in the Truman administration.
Wow.
That struggle began right here in Pasadena in 1942.
Wow.
So there's a long history in this city. And this is an opportunity for us to write that history, to rewrite that history in the right way. I think that's a great privilege for us to be able to take on that kind of a righteous cause.
Well, thank you so much, Rick Cole, for inspiring us to empower our renters, no matter what color they are. And listeners, viewers, while housing is a complicated issue, the more diverse the voices are that become involved, the stronger our cases for humane and sensible housing policies in our city. It is organizations like POP and Making Housing and Community Happen that have regularly offered educational opportunities to understand the ins and outs of this complicated issue. Don't forget one's coming up next Saturday, January 26th. So you can learn
23rd,
20,
Hannah?
sorry, 20,
23rd.
thank you.
23rd.
23rd. Yeah. That's right. There's 5 Sundays in January this year. You can learn more about POP at poppasadena.org, and you can find this episode on the Radio Jornalera Facebook page. Thank you to our techie, Francesco Canes, today. Please share this episode widely, Warriors of Justice, and play a role in the movement for social change, the beautiful struggle for freedom and equality for all. We end with one more red hot song. This is Donnie, California from the album Stadium Arcadium. Good night and good luck.